Hello, everyone. My name is Marije Spek, and I am the Program Manager for the Center for Netherlandish Art at the MFA. On behalf of my collaborators, Christopher Adkins and Antien Knaap, we thank you for joining us today for this program, Youthful Ambition, Anthony van Dyck's Self-Portrait as Icarus. Although we are in a virtual space today, we would like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, founded in 1870, stands on the historic homelands of the Massachusetts people, a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different nations. As a museum, we acknowledge the long history of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. We can all learn more about the Massachusetts people who can continue to be stewards of this land by visiting massachusettstribe.org. Please note that this program is being recorded. The resulting recording may be uploaded to YouTube and the MFA's website. A transcript and closed captions for this program are available through Rev for Zoom live captions. To enable closed captions, go to the bottom of the Zoom window, click the up arrow button next to closed caption, and then click on Show Subtitle to start displaying Rev live captions. We're going to try to say our name when a new speaker begins to help lend clarity to the transcript. During the session, questions can be shared via Zoom's Q&A function, and we encourage you to do so. I would like to thank the delegation of Flanders to the USA for the support in making this program possible. It is my pleasure to now give the floor to Yves Wantens, General Delegate of Flanders to the USA.
Hi, good day to all of you. Greetings from New York. My name is Yves Wantens, and I'm the General Representative of the Government of Flanders in the USA. So it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome all of you, participants, panelists, all of you attending the webinar, to the event today on Anthony van Dyck's self-portrait as Icarus. I want to thank in particular Chris Adkins, the director of the Van Otterloo Weatherbie Center for Netherlandish Art, and Antien Knaap, curatorial research fellow in Art of Europe at the MFA in Boston. The painting we're talking about today, or one of the paintings we will talk about today, is a promised gift to the MFA from the Van Otterloo Collection, and together with the promised painting of the portrait of Senator, a gift from Susan and Matthew Weatherbie, all of them will be displayed in the reinstalled galleries for Flemish and Dutch art at the museum. Personally, I can't wait to see those being displayed and all the other works who will be available on display from the fall of this year. Before closing my remarks, I also would like to say a word of welcome to my compatriot, Professor van der Stichelen from the KUL, Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and to Professor Larry Silver from the University of Pennsylvania. So good luck to all of you, and I'm gonna pass the floor now to Chris. Chris, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Christopher Adkins, the Van Otterloo Weatherbie Director of the Center for Netherlandish Art at the MFA Boston. Thank you, Yves, for those warm words of welcome and for kicking off today's event. I also want to thank Yves and the Flemish delegation to the United States for supporting this program. Yves and his colleagues have been tremendous advocates for the CNA and our efforts to promote the study and appreciation of Flemish art in Boston and beyond. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the MFA who've worked so hard to make this program a reality, including Marije Spek, Sophia Walter, PJ Goodwin, Blair Hollis, Emma Rose Rainville, and of course, Antien Knaap. Thanks as well to our esteemed speakers for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And it is a pleasure to share aspects of our significant collection of Flemish art and spark dynamic conversations about it through our Center for Netherlandish Art. Opening this coming fall with new and expanded presentation of Dutch and Flemish art at the MFA, featuring the historical holdings combined with selections from the transformative promised gifts of the Van Otterloo and Weatherbie collections. We will also be opening the CNA Library and Forum within the MFA, a library and study center focused on Dutch and Flemish art, especially that created during the long 17th century. In turn, these new facilities will form the base from which we will host a robust slate of public and academic programs. Can I have the next slide, please? But before diving deep into the art of Anthony van Dyck, I would like to give a brief overview of Flemish paintings at the MFA for context. Next slide, please. The collection includes singular works by Pictorial Rubens, such as these, that have been at the MFA for a long time and have been crowd favorites in our galleries. Next slide, please. In total, there are 65 paintings in the historic MFA collection. An additional 9 paintings will be joining the MFA collections in the promised gifts from the Van Otterloos and Weatherbies, making the combined collections in the future 74 paintings, a remarkable number and a large percentage of our Netherlandish art collection. Also, when thinking about Flemish representation in the MFA collections, do please also note that we have a significant collection of prints and drawings, about 100 tapestries, and even some early musical instruments, making Boston a destination for scholars and art lovers alike. Next slide, please. The MFA actively collects 17th century Flemish art. In 2000, we added this wonderful collection object by Theodor van Loon, which occupies a pride of place in our Flemish art presentation within our Koch Gallery of European Baroque art. Next slide, please. And just this past spring, we added this wonderful painting from the Abrams collection to our holdings, a fantastic early rustic scene by the master Adrian Brouwer, who did much to continue the legacy of Bruegel and promote its continuation in both Flanders and the Dutch Republic, from Teniers through Van Ostade. Next slide, please. You can see this, this picture today in a new presentation, a preview presentation, collecting Dutch and Flemish paintings, a Boston story, on view now while we work on installing the rest of the galleries. And you'll see it alongside loans, remarkably, from both the Van Otterloo collection and the Weatherbie collection, providing an extraordinary deep dive into an artist who, while influential, had a small oeuvre. And together gives us a wholly new aspect of Flemish art to share with our visitors. Next slide, please. Turning to Van Dyck, these 3 paintings up to now have given us an important but modest presence of the work of Anthony van Dyck in our galleries. These works are probably not as well known to scholars, as they have rarely appeared in exhibitions on the artist recently. This is perhaps resulting from, but the cleaning and treatments in the last 15 years have given them new luster. And they give us a nice introduction to Van Dyck's portraiture, especially his second Antwerp period, which existed from 1627 to 32, and then his London period, wherein he was a grand portrait painter in 1632 to 41. Next slide, please. But I'm thrilled to give you a preview today of our designs for the expanding presentation of Van Dyck within our overall suite of Dutch and Flemish galleries. Beginning this fall, 2 more paintings by the master will hang on our walls. Self-portrait is Icarus from 1618, which we'll talk a lot about today, as well as Portrait of a Senator from about 1627. These not only increase the number of works by Van Dyck on view, but give us a number of other interesting avenues to examine his career. One from his first Antwerp period, a work soon after his return from Italy, and of course, a mythological picture to go alongside his portraiture. Next slide, please. The Icarus will be displayed in this presentation. This is a mock-up of one of our prime galleries for Flemish and Dutch art on a wall featuring some of our most significant treasures. 3 works by Rubens, Mouly Ahmad, for example, in the middle, 2 oil sketches, 2 works by Teniers, and on the far right, actually a Dutch artist, painting of Judah and Tamar. This presentation foregrounds storytelling and narrative essential to Flemish art and the inspiration of mythology. Next slide, please. On the opposite wall, you see Van Dyck's Portrait of a Senator. Here it will be included in a presentation of largely Dutch paintings. To its right are 3 paintings by the so-called Utrecht Caravaggisti, Baburen, Terbruggen, and Honthorst. On the left, a work by Frans Hals, to which I will return momentarily, and a early 18th century ship model of a vessel from the Dutch East India Company, which helps provide the context of the age of exploration in which all of these works were created. Next slide, please. But this painting, the portrait of a senator, traditionally identified as a senator from Antwerp, which is a promised gift from Susan and Matthew Weatherbie, is a great addition to our presentation. It is from Van Dyck's second Antwerp period. Van Dyck returned to Antwerp in the summer of 1627, and we believe that he painted this painting shortly thereafter. It owes much to the work of Titian, who Van Dyck would have seen and studied during his Italian period. We see the relationship in the composition, the coloring, and the overall approach. Indeed, the blacks, they are deep and luscious and luxurious, really luminous, even though they are black. But of course, there's also the brilliance of the nonchalance and the grace of the sitter, and the masterful execution by the artist to arrive at this image of relaxed refinement. Next slide, please. So we will be hanging these two works side by side, Hals and Van Dyck, two of the great portraitists of the 17th century, both masters of bravura painting, Flemish and Dutch. And these two artists actually have been linked, at least since the 18th century, when Arnold Houbraken described in his biography of Hals a meeting of the two artists, and indeed an artistic competition to see who was the better painter. This narrative may be apocryphal, we're not quite sure, but there is reason to question whether they had a relationship or at least knew of each other's work. Van Dyck, as we know, is from Antwerp and spent two significant working periods. Frans Hals, lesser remembered, was actually born in Antwerp himself and immigrated as a young child to Haarlem. He also spent a formative period of about 3 months in 1616. And we know increasingly about the works of art by Van Dyck, especially in the Dutch Republic. So one wonders what the relationships could have been, or the familiarity, perhaps, between the two artists. And this is an unusual opportunity to see works by both artists side by side and to marvel at the bravura treatment of fabrics, which is almost as important for both artists as capturing a distinctive likeness. Next slide, please. We will also be able to show a portrait of a senator next to this other portrait, which will be a real treat for visitors to see these two new things in the galleries from the Susan and Matthew Weatherbie Collection, an earlier work by Frans Hals, where visitors can compare the approach and think about these two different but yet related approaches to portraiture at very close to the same moment in time, and see how Van Dyck was innovative in a Northern European context. Next slide, please. That said, we are not inserting Hals into Flemish galleries, nor are we inserting Van Dyck into Dutch ones, but we're putting them together in a shared space so that we can tease out the relationships through direct comparison. This is an intentional strategy to put masterworks of Dutch and Flemish art in conversation, in dialogue, so that we can better be able to explore and interrogate different contexts, but share traditions. And I should remind you that that was but one gallery in our new presentation. We will have a newly installed suite of galleries dedicated to Netherlandish art, wherein we will explore themes and contexts such as the Northern tradition of painting, global engagement, art for the home, and art for the market. And we will have over 100 paintings on view, over a third of them Flemish. And this, I would also point out that one of our galleries will be programmed by the CNA as a rotating space. And this is central to the vision for the CNA and serious commitment to share scholarship on the art of the period with the aim of inspiring audiences and generating future engagement by scholars and the public alike. So stay tuned and please come and visit our galleries beginning in fall 2021. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Next slide, please. Caroline van den Sticklen is professor of early modern art history at the Catholic University at Leuven. Following a tenure as senior research fellow at the National Fund for Scientific Research, she has been teaching at Leuven since 1995 and has been full professor since 2007. Professor van den Sticklen is one of the world's leading experts on 17th century Flemish art, Van Stickman contributed to the major exhibitions on Anthony van Dyck in Antwerp and London in 1999. In the same year, she and Mirjam Weston of the Museum voor Moderne Kunst Arnhem curated the first exhibition of women artists in Belgium and the Netherlands from 1500 to 1950. In 2015, she was one of the board members and contributors of the exhibition in the Rubens House, Rubens in Private, the master portrays his family. Meanwhile, she published widely on different aspects of Flemish art in general and Flemish portraiture in particular. In 2018, she curated an exhibition on Michelina Boutier in Antwerp and edited the accompanying catalog. Recently, she completed a volume for the Corpus Rubenianum on Rubens's unidentified portraits, co-authored with Hans Vliege. Since 2013, she has also collaborated with Axis, a research group of the chemistry department at the University of Antwerp, to investigate 17th century Flemish paintings by using macroscopic imaging via XRF, XRD, and FTIR. Today, she will expand on her 2017 Burlington magazine article, Fraternal Love, Van Dyck's Early Daedalus and Icarus Rediscovered. Professor Vanden Stickman.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Chris. I feel really very honored to be here on this digital platform today. Last year, I heard that Van Dyck's early painting of Daedalus and Icarus would be a promised gift of Rosemarie and Eik van Otterloo in support of the Center for Netherlandish Art in Boston. It was wonderful news. One of the most intriguing paintings of young Anthony van Dyck that was hidden for centuries in several private collections would be permanently on display for the public. First slide, please. The recently rediscovered painting represents a marked shift in the depiction of the myth in the southern Netherlands, and also occupies a unique place in the Antwerp painter's early oeuvre. The original quote from the Bible reads, "Pride goes before destruction, and the haughty spirit before the fall." Versions of this proverb have been passed down from various ancient sources, but Ovid's Metamorphoses is the best known. 17th century Antwerp artists were conversant with Ovid's writings. In the southern Netherlands, the subject was usually shown in a landscape setting, a tradition going back to Peter Bruegel the Elder's famous painting of the subject. Next slide, please. Icarus tumbling from the sky made the moral message explicit and provided artists with ideal staffage for a sweeping landscape. Artists were attracted by drama of the fatal ending to the tale, which is why the fall of Icarus is the most frequently depicted episode. Artists often identified themselves with Icarus, hoping that, unlike him, they would choose the golden mean and reign in their artistic ambition. Can we go back to the first slide, please? The moment Van Dyck chose to paint is described in detail in Book 8 of the Metamorphoses. I quote, "His son Icarus stood next to him, and not realizing that he was handling things that would endanger him, caught laughingly at the down that blew in the passing breeze and softened the yellow bee's wax with his thumb. And in this play, hindered his father's marvelous work. When he had put the last touches to what he had begun, the artificer balanced his own body between the two wings and hovered in the moving air. He instructed the boy as well, saying, 'Let me warn you, Icarus, to take the middle way. In case the moisture weighs down your wings, if you fly too low, or if you go too high, the sun scorches them. Listen, travel between the extremes.' At the same time, as he laid down the rules of flight, he fitted the newly created wings on the boy's shoulders. While he worked and issued his warnings, the aging man's cheeks were wet with tears. The father's hands trembled." End of quote. In Van Dyck's painting, the viewer is confronted with a life-size figures of father and son, embodying age and youth, wisdom and foolishness, fear and confidence, the tragic denouement yet to come. Until recently, Van Dyck's Daedalus and Icarus has been undeservedly neglected. Yet the picture impressive pedigree can be traced back to the sale of the collection of Gilbert Marshall, held in London in 1776. In the sale catalogue, the painting is described in detail. I quote, Daedalus and Icarus by Van Dyck. The painter has here introduced his own portrait in the character of Icarus, with an old attendant as Daedalus tying on his wings. By this allegory, the artist imitates his intention of becoming an historical as well as a portrait painter. End of quote. The painting's provenance is also given. The picture was purchased out of the family of Bishop Trist of Ghent. And to remove all doubt of its originality, Mr. Bertels, the owner of the picture, warrants it to be a real performance of Van Dyck. End of quote. As it turns out, the catalogue entry of 1776 provides the name of the painting's owner when it was sent to auction. The owner is called Mr. Bertels, and it was he who provided the information that the painting came from Bishop Trist's family. Bertels, as the British phonetically called him, can be identified as Jean Bertels of Brussels. He was an expert and an art dealer who exported Flemish art to London in the second half of the 18th century. While we have only the word of Jean Bertels that the painting came from Bishop Trist's collection, it seems to be very probable that Trist was indeed its first owner. Trist, Bishop of Ghent, was a preeminent collector of late 16th century art and the leading patron of contemporary masters. He procured commissions from Flemish and Dutch artists such as Rubens, Van Dyck, De Niers, Rambouts, and Jan Lievens. Anthony van Dyck painted his portrait in around 1627. The third slide, please. He painted his portrait in around 1627, and about 2 years later, Trist engaged him to paint the crucifixion for the high altar of the Capuchin church in Dendermonde, near Ghent. The bishop's funerary monument, next slide please, by the brothers Duque Noir in St. Bavo's in Ghent, is a masterpiece of Flemish Baroque sculpture. Van Dyck's frequent contacts with Bishop Trist would have given this prominent patron every opportunity to buy the painting of Daedalus and Icarus, to buy it directly from the painter. Unfortunately, no inventory of Trist's collection has been preserved. At the auction in London in 1776, the picture was almost certainly acquired by Richard Payne Knight, and it was still in his collection 2 years later, as is clear from the counterproof of a mezzotint of the painting by John Watts. Next, please, which records the painting in Knight's collection. This faithful and detailed reproduction of the painting was published with the title Van Dyck in the character of Icarus. Next slide, please, and dated the 1st June of 1778. The inscription on the first stage reads, from a capital picture, in the collection of Richard Knight, Esquire. Watts' engraving of 1778 shows that Payne Knight esteemed the painting very highly. Payne Knight was a remarkable collector of antique gems, next please, coins and bronzes. He was a trustee of the British Museum, to which he bequeathed his collection of antiquities and drawings. It is hardly surprising that a collector with knowledge of classical antiquity would be interested in buying a painting of Daedalus and Icarus. In his An Inquiry into the Symbolical Language of Ancient Art and Mythology, he refers to the story of Daedalus, and to Daedalus especially as the builder of the celebrated labyrinth. As you can see, Thomas Lawrence painted his portrait. Van Dyck's Daedalus and Icarus subsequently entered the collection of Payne Knight's cousin Edward Knight and was sold at the auction of the collection of Edward's son, John Knight, in 1819. After 1819, the painting changed hands several times, including the notable collection of Hugh Andrew Johnston Munro of Norfolk, a patron of Turner and the executor of his will, to mention just one of the previous owners. Next slide, please. On the 4th of December 2014, the painting was sold at Sotheby's, London, described as an 18th century follower of Sir Anthony van Dyck. Never a greater injustice has been done to a 17th century painting. The provenance of the painting alone proves that the most eminent former collectors have been aware of the uniqueness of Van Dyck's Daedalus and Icarus. Fortunately for us, as for the Center for Netherlandish Art, Eyck and Annemarie van Otterloo emphatically shared this traditional position. Let's return to the painting itself. In Daedalus and Icarus, the two protagonists are depicted half-length, before a distant view of the sea and a mountain ridge at the lower right. The youthful Icarus occupies almost half of the picture plane, while his father, Daedalus, appears to be kneeling as he ties a large ring to his son's shoulder with a blue ribbon. Despite their proximity, Icarus avoids his father's gaze, looking dreamily out of the picture. With the exception of a few details, the right section of the painting is confidently and evenly executed, while the left seems to be less certain. While Daedalus' head is masterfully rendered with broad brushstrokes, its foreshortening was a challenge for the young artist, and the anatomy of his chest and neck is not convincing in all respects. Van Dyck's difficulty in rendering bodies in motion is characteristic of his earliest history scenes. At the outset of his career, Van Dyck frequently focused on two half-length figures, emulating the work of Titian and Rubens. Even before he went to Italy, Van Dyck took inspiration from Italian compositions. He aimed to emulate Rubens' virtuoso rendering of bodies in every conceivable pose. The letters Ganymede would have represented the great challenge. Next, please. Following one, please. And the sculpture rendering of such a nude body, next, please, may have been a source of inspiration for the young master. It is clear that Daedalus and Icarus from Van Dyck's I hope you're still there. So I was talking about, for example, the elaborately arranged drapery on the painting by Van Dyck, which differ from Rubens' more plastic approach, as you can see on this slide. In 1617, or soon after, Christ carrying the cross. Next, please. One of the 15 panels representing the mysteries of the Rosary, made for the Church of St. Paul in Antwerp. Van Dyck was already highly regarded and was paid for this painting 150 guilders, the same amount as Rubens and Jordaens, who also contributed to this series. This painting is striking for its broad brushwork. Next, please. Particularly in Christ's face, as you see here, while parts of the anatomy, next, please, are unconvincingly rendered. The same technique appears in Abraham and Isaac in Prague, next, please, also dating from around 1617, 1618, which shares similarities of both subject and style, with, of course, the painting of Icarus. Great attention is paid to the rendering of Abraham's physiognomy, and his skin is aged by the sun, while the technique used for Isaac's face is more refined and the flesh is paler. Abraham's profile is based on a study of a head by Van Dyck, now in the Musée de Picardie in Amiens, a head that features regularly in his early work. Next, please. The man in Amiens with a sharp nose and tangled hair and beard is very close to that of Daedalus. Next, please, albeit in reverse. Also, Van Dyck's Saint Sebastian, bound for martyrdom, next, dates from the same year, 1617, 1618. The saint's stance, the set of his shoulders and turning of the head are comparable to Icarus pose, while the contrast between the saint's milk-white body and the bronzed body of the old man is also very similar to that in the Daedalus. An old man to the right of Saint Sebastian attempts to bind the saint's left hand. The curve of his back and the clenched fist are similar to those of Daedalus, but here again in reverse. In a somewhat later Saint Sebastian in Munich, next please, datable around 1620, the contrast between the youth's stout physique and the crouching older man is similar to that in the Daedalus and Icarus. The refined feature of Icarus' torso makes it clear that it must have been painted after the Saint Sebastian in Paris, since its techniques anticipates Van Dyck's self-portrait in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Next, please. Icarus is first described as a self-portrait of Van Dyck in the sales catalogue of 1776, and the inscription on what's print of 1778 states quite plainly from his first Antwerp period leaves no doubt that Icarus bears the young painter's features. By comparing other and even younger self-portraits of Van Dyck with the Boston one, such as the self-portrait in the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna. Next, please. From around 1615, and the self-portrait of the Rubens house, datable around 1616, 1617, illustrates, in my view, the similarities in physiognomy, and maybe even in expression. Next, please. An experiment launched with the collaboration of the Department of Electrical Engineering of the University of Leuven by using forensic analysis confirmed our presumptions even more. This 3D reconstruction of the head of young Anthony, at which different sides of the face were constructed, likewise corroborates the identification. The question why Van Dyck was interested in this subject at this moment in his career is unclear. Was he commissioned to paint a theme for an erudite patron, such as Bishop Trees, or did he himself come up with the idea of experimenting with a mythological subject that he conceived in a new way? The innovations he introduced in these early paintings attest to his intuitive and empathic approach to religious and mythological scenes. The painting was examined with infrared reflectography. Next, please, which reveals the painting's original appearance. Daedalus' left arm was originally raised in an arc, and Icarus' right hand did not rest on his father's head, as now, but was raised, the palm of the hand facing out, and the fingers spread and extended up. This expressive gesture of a hand silhouetted against a dark background is a trademark of Van Dyck's early work. Next, please. For example, also found in Samson and Delilah in the Dulwich Gallery in London. Apparently, Van Dyck was dissatisfied with this, and in a second attempt tried to make the composition more static and calm, but evidently he also wrestled with a second version. Next, please. Daedalus' left hand emerges from behind the rib and grips its edge, His arms seems much too long in a way, while Icarus' gesture of touching his father's hair is anatomically, more or less unconvincing. The background in Daedalus and Icarus, painted in very thinly applied broad strokes of paint, indicates that this passage held less interest for the painter at that time. He only wanted to concentrate on the figures. Patimenti can be discerned in both of Icarus' shoulders, his right hand and Daedalus' back. The contours of the figures are not sharply delineated, but indicated with strokes of dark brown paint, which heighten the sculptural quality of the bodies. This is also a feature in the self-portraits and in the Christ carrying the cross. Next, please, as we have seen. A beautiful detail here of this painting, Christ carrying the cross. It would seem that we can cautiously date Daedalus and Icarus around 1619, during his most experimental period, when he was attempting to distinguish his style from that of Rubens. Still not 20 years old, he struggled with the composition, but his virtuoso use of the brush overcame an initial lack of coherence, and he managed to express vividly the contrasting expressions of father and son. Let's go back to some initial questions. Who, what, when, why? Next, please. At the very beginning of his career, young Anthony designed an unprecedented pictorial narrative by confronting the ingenious father and his daring son at the moment before escaping the labyrinth. The atmosphere is emotionally highly charged. Daedalus realizes that his fears will come true and that Icarus will ignore his father's advice. The story is about paternal love, about adolescence and adulthood, about temerity and discipline. Anthony van Dyck painted the mythological scene at the very beginning of his career. There is little information about his relationship with his father, but we know that Francois van Dyck, his father, was close to insolvency around 1618. It's understandable that young Anthony wanted to free himself from this social tragedy and attempted to distance himself from the omnipotent Rubens, who was his senior by 22 years. Since 1617, Van Dyck had become Rubens' most talented pupil, and his ambition must have been unlimited. Undoubtedly, Anthony wasn't charmed by the moral of the story to walk the middle path, but he was challenged to become outstanding. He would spread his wings without taking too much help from others. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catalina. Really engaging and giving us so much to think about. Look forward to talking in the roundtable. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second esteemed panelist. Larry Silver is the Farquhar Professor of Art History Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania. He previously taught at Berkeley and Northwestern University, and he is a specialist in painting and graphics of Northern Europe, particularly during the 16th century. His published books of closest interest to today's topic include Peasant Scenes and Landscapes from 2006, Peter Bruegel, 2011, and Rubens, Velasquez, and the King of Spain, 2014, co-authored with Aneta Georgievska-Shine. And he also co-curated several print exhibitions, including Graven Images in 1993 and Grand Scale in 2008. Professor Silver has also served as president of the College Art Association and the Historians of Netherlandish Art. His talk today will discuss images of the Icarus theme from Bruegel to Rubens. And before I turn the floor over, please remember panel attendees, do please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can have additional questions and discussion in our roundtable. The floor is now yours, Larry.
Thank you, Dr. Atkins. I want to thank you and Antien Knaap and Maria Speck for the invitation to speak. And of course, the Van Otterloo Weatherbie Center for Netherlandish Art for this occasion. In contrast to the very moving father and son image, very unusual, of Icarus, I'll be taking you on a kind of historical flashback a truly Netherlandish one, because we'll see that some of the artists who painted in the Netherlands, in the North Netherlands, came from Flanders. And we'll see one artist who never left Flanders and end up with Peter Bruegel, who in some ways is the poster child for Flanders, or was so regarded by the early scholars who rediscovered him in the late 19th century as Belgians. Could I have the first slide, please? This is an image by the mentor of Van Dyck, but it's not painted by his own hand. Could we have the next slide, please? It's not Rubens, it's after Rubens. It is, of course, his image of Icarus, and a very different image it is. An image of a beautiful young man still, but one who is in the midst of tragedy, being passed by his own father as they fly. He is obviously toppled from a higher point where the beams of the sun are visible above him. This picture was one of a set of probably over 40 mythological scenes, mostly taken from Ovid, which were painted on commission after 1636 for the King of Spain, Philip IV, for his redecorated and architecturally expanded hunting lodge, the Torre de la Parada. And it was meant in many ways to be a kind of warning to the monarch about the dangers of pride and unweaning ambition as a ruler with all of the absolutist authority that pertained in the 17th century. Could we have the next slide, please? This is the oil sketch by Peter Paul Rubens. Next slide, please, which is now in the Brussels Museum, probably designed in the latter portions of the commission for the Torre de la Parada. And you can see the incredible bravura brushwork, even of the aged Rubens, who managed to generate those 40 canvases or so, chiefly with the aid of assistants. Some of them we know, like Erasmus Colinus, Jacob Jordaens, and Jan Cossiers, among others, but some of which were actually painted by Rubens himself, even at that very large scale. Importantly here, though, the focus is still on the human body. And in fact, to use a favorite device that Christopher Adkins used in his wonderful show about Rubens in Philadelphia, if we invert this picture and see the outstretched arms of the youth, we can also recall Rubens' drawings, which were made for the elevation of the cross, one of his first great commissions when he returned to Antwerp in 1608 from an almost decade-long study in Italy. So it has the hallmarks of his complete mastery of human anatomy, but also of the beauty of the human body. Rubens used a young man, possibly identified as the even younger Anthony van Dyck, for those drawings, one of which, if I recall correctly, is in the Harvard Art Museums. And here we see the tragedy and the pain and the startling discovery of his impending doom on the face of young Icarus. Can we have the next, please? This is an engraving by the brother of the artist who made it. The artist is artist Colinus, and it's an image of Icarus, which shows in this engraving more clearly than in the relief that it copies the beautiful image of the sun and the falling feathers. Again, the landscape is a relatively minor object, and it's the beauty and the tragedy of this young hero. Included here too is some attention to how the wings were attached. You see the straps on the biceps of the young and beautiful Laocoon inspired figure of Icarus. Artist Colinus, who was a Flemish sculptor, could we have the next, please? Went north to Amsterdam and stayed there over the first important decade of the decoration of the Amsterdam Town Hall after the independence of the Dutch Republic in 1648. His carvings in relief, but also in high relief as well, decorated the interior of the town hall. You can see a little bit less clearly in the current state of the relief that Daedalus is still visible as moving upward, but minding the limits of the sun, whereas this beautiful body, which was also the product of study in Italy when Colinus went there and met the Flemish sculptor resident in Rome, Francois Duque Noir, brought the knowledge that he acquired in that country back to the Low Countries. Importantly, though, what's interesting about the location of this relief is that it was on the doorway of the bankruptcy chamber in the town hall, And it, in fact, though it won't show up in any of the slides I could obtain, it has a frame around it with emblems of empty chests, unpaid bills, worthless stock, and rats. So it's an image of pride in the financial world going before the fall of bankruptcy. Could I have the next, please? This remarkable image, and the next will give us the label, is by Hendrick Goldcius, the great Netherlandish engraver who turned to painting actually earlier than Rubens was famous for his. The engraving that you see is 1588. After 1600, Gulcius would paint for almost 2 decades and give up engraving entirely. But at this stage of his career, he was absolutely obsessed with the human body, its muscles, its exaggerated postures, and its foreshortenings. You see that he was very much in the thrall of a group of artists, starting with some Prague innovators, but focusing on Cornelis van Haarlem, who actually did the design for this print of Icarus. Once again, the landscape is only dimly present, a few towering mountains and the broad expanse of sea, but the whole focus is this foreshortened figure who is directly under the sun. And at a much more prudent distance, Daedalus moves forward, not even realizing yet what tragedy is befalling the son, who he so tenderly embraced in the Van Dyck picture, and according to the Ovid text, was so close to as well. I'll read a couple of other passages from Ovid that Kathleen didn't get to talk about exactly what begins to get adapted from that original Latin text of the 1st century CE for these images. But here, interestingly enough, this rounded form is part of a set of 4 prints, all of whom are characterized as disgracers. That is to say, people whose vices got them into irrevocable harm. Let me read you the inscription, a translation of the inscription that runs around this print in Latin. It is something divine to want to acquire knowledge, the gift of God, but man must keep to his limits. As long as everyone has his own wisdom and does not keep the right measure in mind, Icarus gives his name to the Icarian Sea. Could I have the next slide, please? Making the issue even more explicit that this is a characterization of shortcomings and human folly, vanity, and ultimately sinfulness, which will be punished inevitably. We see 2 of the other remaining 3 tondos here. The one on the left is Ixion. The one on the right, probably very similar to the Icarus turned around by Gulcius and Cornelis van Haarlem, whose name you can see inscribed at the very bottom of the print, along with the initials of the engraver Gulcius. This is the figure of Theoton, who rashly, as the son of Apollo, took the reins of the chariot of the sun and didn't know how to fly yet, was again too inexperienced and too rash to take heed of the dangers. And he lost command of the chariot. You see the horses, in fact, as well as the chariot falling in the distance at the top of the print. And he also fell to his doom in the sea. Here's what that inscription says. A wise man does not approve ambition, but prizes expressions of praise. He prizes them if they go to good people. Thus, the fall of Theoton teaches us that impetuosity comes to a bad end. So in fact, Icarus here is less a tragic hero than a vain and lapsing sinner. And he's also, of course, a study in the human body, seen from below and from the front, whereas Phaeton is seen from below and from the back. Could I have the next, please? Now, Gulcius was active in Haarlem, and Colinus, who moved from his Antwerp workshop to Amsterdam, was truly a Netherlandish artist on both sides of the modern border. But this is an artist who stayed in Flanders and who often collaborated with others. He was a landscape specialist named Joost de Momper. He became a master in 1581, and among other artists, he collaborated with Jan Bruegel on a number of paintings of the Four Seasons in particular, but also as Bruegel provided some of the the figures, he collaborated on these kinds of narratives as well. In this case, we don't know whether he collaborated with a figure painter, but certainly we recognize the scene instantly as the scene of Daedalus flying on the left center and Icarus tumbling from the upper left of the picture. The painting, could we have the next slide, is now in Stockholm in the National Museum. But of course, we notice at once how different this picture is from the body-centered, almost fixated images of Gulcius, Colinus, and Rubens that we've seen before. This is a work that actually post-dates the Gulcius, but I bring it in here to introduce this whole subsidiary world that we begin to notice in a number of the Icarus subjects. Notice in the lower left, we have a fisherman with his pole. We have a plowman in the lower center. And at a slight distance on the right, in the middle ground, we see a shepherd with his flocks. You may well ask, why are they there? The landscape itself is certainly much more elaborated, and we see sailing ships of various kinds, including a Mediterranean galley down below, representing the kind of Mediterranean world in which Ovid's scene takes place. Indeed, the island of Icaria and the Icarian Sea are named after Icarus in the Mediterranean. Well, let me explain. I'll turn back to the text of Ovid, which we heard from Kathleen van der Stichelen, but this is now a portion of the story that wasn't in those pictures. And here I begin to quote. The translation is by Alan Mandelbaum. A fisherman who with his pliant rod was angling there below caught sight of them, and then a shepherd leaning on his staff, and two, a peasant leaning on his plow, saw them and were dismayed. They thought, these must surely be some gods sky voyaging. So there's a case where the high flight, both the ingenuity of Daedalus and the overweening ambition of Icarus are taken to contrast with the ordinary events of husbandry in nature, the world of attending to the fish, to the flocks, and to the plowing of the farmer. So Momper has taken the text of Ovid rather more literally and made this into far less of an obvious tragedy, but much more of a contrast, which unfolds in the upper left diagonal, whereas the world, earthbound, appears in the brownish tones of the lower right diagonal. Could I have the next, please? De Momper was certainly not the only artist to pick up on the original text of Ovid. And here Hans Boll, who stands really quite close to Peter Bruegel, very much influenced by him and very much a kind of continuator of the landscapes that he made, of the designs for prints that he made, though he was best known for a lot of works that don't survive from his native Mechelen, which would have been large-scale paintings in watercolor, as we call it, not exactly modern watercolor, but indeed something closer to gouache probably, on linen, something of the scale of tapestries. Most of those have perished due to climate and issues of fragility. But Boll also later in his career, after emigrating in 1484 to the North Netherlands from Mechelen and Antwerp, went north to first Dordrecht, but eventually settled in Amsterdam. And he began to specialize in much more elegant small scale works, usually painted on parchment or vellum. And that's the case here for this work now in the Vanden Museum in Antwerp, a work that's dated 1590. And here the figures of the Ovidian story are flying at roughly the same altitude, though presumably Icarus will fall very soon. He doesn't seem to be already in his fall. And if you look carefully in the middle ground, you can see the two figures actually taking off from underneath that island castle. So this is a narrative that actually shows two successive moments of the story, but not yet the tragic image. This actually too adheres much more closely to the Ovidian poetry by showing especially the plowman looking upward and exclaiming, these must be gods who are in the sky. And we see in the lower left corner men who are off to market with their dogs, also probably shepherds ultimately, with that kind of canine. And in the lower right corner, we do see another shepherd and an angler, both of whom look up in amazement. In fact, each of the figures in the bowl image is following Ovid closely and looking up in amazement. The landscape is still relatively formulaic and relatively still close to the 16th century model, in which atmosphere is provided by a haziness at the horizon and a washing out of colors into this kind of light blue. We move from brown to green to that atmospheric light blue. Very much a 16th century landscape formula, and something still practiced by de Montfort in oils. Could we have the next, please? Next slide. Just to remind you, and the next one, which will give the label, to remind you that Boll was as much a printmaker as he was a painter. He, in fact, designed the completing prints for a cycle of the 4 seasons that Peter Bruegel began for Hieronymus Koch in a cycle of 4 prints of the seasons in Antwerp. This is an etching. Boll managed to pick up that technique, but for the most part, too, he also designed drawings to be engraved by professionals within the print world of late 16th century Antwerp. And this etching, probably made before he departed for the North Netherlands, shows pretty much what we saw in his eventual Antwerp small painting. But here we do see Icarus tumbling too close to the sun, Daedalus moving as our eye does off to the right from the left. The plowman is in the lower left corner, the shepherd in the lower right corner. And this is very much an earthbound world, again, in the lower half, to contrast with the tragedy above. In the time that remains, however, I'd like to spend a little bit of time with Peter Bruegel, please. And I probably have too many slides, but we'll see. Next slide, please. This is a famous work now in Brussels, long considered an original by Peter Bruegel the Elder, but now often doubted in terms of its condition as well as its painting technique. Christina Curry and Dominique Allard have done a very extensive technical study of this work. Even a casual observer can see how much has been rubbed in the sky portion and above the sails of the sailing ship in the sea. But it has all the hallmarks of Bruegel himself. It's usually been called an early work, and one of the things we can discuss perhaps in the roundtable is why I consider it almost a decade later than almost every book labels it. I call it around 1565. Could we have the next slide, please? There's another version of this, which is in the Van Buren collection, also in Brussels, but available to the public, which shows something missing in the Brussels Museum version. It shows the figure of Daedalus. We can't be sure, in fact, whether the original composition included Daedalus moving successfully with his wings or not. What we, of course, I'm sure that the listeners to this particular talk will realize that the obvious figure of Icarus is hard to find. Indeed, his legs are the only portion visible in the lower right corner, above that prominent bird and beneath that prominent ship. I can get into those details too in the roundtable if I run too much over time. But we see again, following Ovid, the figure of the shepherd. In the lower right, we see an angler and of course, the prominent figure of the plowman. Could I have the next slide, please? The important thing that's been really featured here that was of great interest to Peter Bruegel, especially in the middle 1560s, was this remarkable ocean-bound sailing ship that shows anonymous sailors going up and down its rope ladders and across its sails. What we also notice in the detail is the white streaks, which look almost like some kind of afterthought, but in fact, what they are is the dismembered feathers of the wings of Icarus, which cause him to fall tragically as the wax melts. Could I have the next, please? Next slide, please. Just, well, go back one now. We skipped one. This is to show you that Bruegel also designed a whole set of images of sailing ships, just like this one, which were engraved or etched, a combination of the two processes in the Antwerp workshops of Hieronymus Koch. And we see a magnificent ship, which in fact is dated on its flank, 1564. Next, please. Next slide. There we go. Well, I'll take this one. This detail shows you that strange bird, and I will read you, if time permits in the discussion, who he is. Bruegel has read his Ovid very carefully and picked up the very next lines of what happens as Icarus splashes. And so we have the angler, but we also have that large, in fact, it's a partridge, the Latin word is perdix, and we see all the more clearly the last of the feathers as the body of Icarus hits the waves. Next, please. Bruegel had also been very interested, not just in sailing ships, but in naval battles and in situating, in this case, what looks to be an actual battle in the Straits of Messina or near Naples. It's not clear exactly which, given the volcano there. It's been identified as Naples, but Etna would be plausible as well. And this work has recently been, in effect, reattributed to the master himself rather than a copyist or imitator. So we see that in the 1560s, his fascination with vessels and the very objects that brought prosperity to his native Netherlands and to the great port city metropolis of Antwerp was very much on his mind as a painter, but also as a designer of prints. And here too, we see again the oared galleys of the Mediterranean, locating this very specifically in that region. Next, please. Next slide, please. And so just to return and to sum up, okay, this will work too. I wanted to show you that two of the great 20th century masters also have taken up the Icarus subject. Matisse on the left, who first painted the work or actually made it as cutouts in 1944 and then included it in his published anthology called Jazz. And on the right, we see the work of Pablo Picasso, which is located in the UNESCO building in Paris. Matisse glorifies the ambition and the daring of the young flyer, just as he had been in many of the Rubens-based images. But on the right, Picasso shows bathers watching his collapse into an open ocean and really not even noticing his fall. So I'll stop there and we can leave some of the questions for the discussion roundtable. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. There I am. Hello, my name is Anthony Knaap. I'm the assistant curator in the Art of Europe department here at the MFA, and I'm very pleased to be leading the roundtable discussion. I just want to thank our speakers, Yves Want and Chris Atkins, for their introductions, and Professor van der Stichelen and Professor Silver for their wonderful talks. I love all the details of the folding wings. Let me start with you, Katlijne. Let's see if we can get you on the screen, Larry, if you could turn your camera on. There you are. And Katlijne, I hope you're in view as well. I wanted to ask you, so what we see is that the usual reading of Ovid's myth is that Icarus is an overreacher who brings about his own doom. And it's particularly intriguing, therefore, that Van Dyck, who would have known the ending of the myth, would give Icarus his own features. So I'd love you to explain this irony.
Yes. You can see me now? Just
yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's much easier to talk. Yes, it's a very intriguing, but also a very difficult question. Because, in fact, we have to raise the question whether it was Van Dyck himself or whether it was the bishop who ordered the painting. And I think there are many arguments to consider it, to see it as a commission of the bishop, because we know that he was a very fervent collector, and we also know that he was a very generous man, and I presume that a moralizing message such as is present in this painting by Van Dyck, would have pleased him very, very much. Yeah, he was collecting, but we also know, for example, that he, in his last will, he donated about half of his belongings to the poor people of Ghent. And it says something about his personality. And I think that he must be an art lover, but also that he was a very, very ambitious. When he would have asked Anthony van Dyck to paint this kind of scenery, I think for him it must have been an appeal, a call for modesty, something like that. That was very much, as far as I can see, matching his own way of life. And when we would consider for a moment that, for example, Van Dyck himself would have ordered the painting, then it's, I would say, as complex, because I presume that when he himself decided to paint this painting, that he painted it for the free market. And then again, the question is, why did he include this self-portrait? And yeah, I think we may see it as a kind of a way of self-promotion of the young artist, because why could he have done this? What could have been the profit for him to integrate his own self-portrait? I think he was fond of his own image, can I say, his own features, when he was a young artist in this period between somewhere 1616 and 1621. He painted at least 4 self-portraits, and I think it was his ambition to present himself as much as he could, and it must have been maybe as to wink, to the spectator, I don't know, but there must have been some irony. But it's also possible that he thought, for me, it's an ideal way to tell everyone that I'm here and that I'm a very ambitious painter, and that I will try to convince you of my excellence, my power of expression. And so your question is very, very intriguing, but also very complex. But we should consider whether it was the painter himself or whether it was, for example, Bishop Trist who commissioned the painting. But I think it makes a difference. But the irony, in a way, remains with the painting.
Yeah, it makes it a more complex image.
It's a very complex image, because of course Icarus is a kind of anti-hero. Yeah, and it's to understand why Van Dyck wanted to identify with this Icarus. So it must have to do somewhere with his self-image, maybe his overestimation. And as we said, he was so intrigued and maybe also so obsessed by his own physiognomy that he thought it's challenging to present himself in this kind of portrait historiés. And you also could make the comparison with a couple of representations by him of Saint Sebastian. And there are about 4 versions of Saint Sebastian painted during this first Antwerp period. And for all of them, it has been suggested that Saint Sebastian had the features of the painter himself. So it's a strange way of, can I say, bringing yourself to the foreground?
Right.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
To attract attention, to ask for attention. I think it's very characteristic for this young Anthony, and this kind of ambition and proud. You can even read it from his face, I think, when you look at the early self-portraits.
Yeah, I can certainly, as a parent, identify more with Daedalus and telling my children, don't spread yourself too thin, and they say, oh, I can do it all, you know. So it's I think something that is sort of timeless.
Yeah,
but
I think.
let me switch to Larry. You know, you gave this really wonderful overview and show the richness of the topic and the number of artists who are attracted by it. You did hint at some of your thoughts on the Bruegel, which is of course the what you ended with. So could you talk a little bit about sort of recommendations for future research on the Bruegel picture?
Well, I'd be happy to. I'm thinking we should probably go to the first of the Bruegel slides, which follow Katelijn's added slides as well. Although the ones that are on the screen are complements to the Rubens work for the King. There are two landscapes that you will find, JP. There.
Perfect.
Yeah, both of these. In both cases, we have works that are done for a series about the months, as they're called in the documents. 5 of them survive. I've brought in 2 others, and a third one is behind me, the one in New York, which perhaps is the most familiar of the batch. Many are in Vienna. One of them, the second of these slides, is in Prague. But I want to call attention especially to the cow seen from its rump, to the relatively bulky and silhouetted form of the, in this case, cow herders rather than sheep herders in this work, which is meant to show early autumn. And the landscape which stretches behind already has many of the conventional layouts of Bruegel, which were not so visible in the image of Icarus, but which, could we have the next one, please? But which conform relatively well to the next slide, please. No, go back to then this one. Yes, thanks. This one in the Lobkowitz collection, which also, if we think about the plowman moving off into the distance and look at that trio of people carrying baskets or the woman on the horse, and if we look at this particular landscape and its expanse, we begin to see a kind of confidence and a less formulaic approach to landscape itself, as well as a relative consolidation of Bruegel figure types into these stocky peasant types that you saw, especially in the figures of the Icarus design. If you look at the dated pictures, and there aren't many, but if you look at the dated pictures from around 1557, that do show landscapes. An example is the Parable of the Sower in San Diego. There's much less confidence in both the landscape and the figure. And in the early Bruegel landscape designs, there's much more of a kind of formulaic adherence to a pattern of recession than we get in this very beautifully calibrated recession into depth. Not to mention what I already showed in the slides, which was that fascination with ships, which is so intense in the early 1560s. So one of the areas for further research, I think, is to take a fresh look at Bruegel pictures in terms of dates. Many of them are undated, even if they're signed. And it's turned out, too, that technical study has revealed the dates we thought were firm are less so. For example, recently, the Du Legret in the same Vandenberg Museum as the bowl turned out to be 1563 instead of 1561. The Winterthur beautiful small snow landscape of the Adoration of the Magi in a Flemish village turns out to be a good deal later than we originally thought. So these kinds of, let's say, fresh viewings of Bruegel in terms of dating, and maybe also a re-examination of the Van Buren picture in terms of technical analysis might get us a little bit closer to a firmer chronological arrangement of Bruegel pictures.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to check in with you talking about new research. Katelijne, you have worked a lot on women artists, but you've also done a lot of archival research on Van Dyck in conjunction with your broader research. So I'm curious, can you share a little bit with us some of your new research on the young Van Dyck? And maybe we can advance, PJ, to the next slide where you have a quote. Or perhaps the next one.
yes, the quote of David Friedberg could be a good starting point for the discussion. But first of all, I want to make clear that, yeah, thank you very much, that most of my archival research was already done a couple of years ago, but I'm still fascinated by the archival sources, yeah, related to Van Dyck. Your question, of course, is related to the fact if you can link life and work of an artist. And I do realize that it's always very tricky and risky to do this and to see the work of an artist as a kind of expression, ultimate expression of the self. And I do realize, of course, that we don't have to do that, but I think that also for early modern artists, that it is interesting to look in what kind of situation they were grown up. Some biographical details may be very, very important. And that's why I think that archival research, just to search for some unknown details from the life of an artist such as Anthony van Dyck is very, very interesting. And when we go back to the first Antwerp period, so let's say the period in which the Daedalus and Icarus has been painted, it was a period in which Van Dyck went to extremely difficult circumstances because he painted it around 1619, and we know that even between 1610 and 1620, that there were very serious family troubles. And he lost his mother when he was only 8 years old. And when he was about 11 years old, we know that there was some incident between his father and a woman. And it was very serious because there was a trial. And we know that this woman was threatening the father of Anthony van Dyck to murder him. And we also know that she made a kind of song just to, how can I say, to blame François van Dyck, the father of Anthony van Dyck, and his family. So we do not know what has happened, but there was a trial, and we also know that the woman was banished from the city of Antwerp. At that moment, Anthony van Dyck was about 11 years old. At that moment, he just entered the workshop of Hendrick van Balen, then dean of the guild in Antwerp. And it must have been confusing, I think, for this young boy. And we know that already about 1615, 1616, that his father had had debts, and that he had serious financial problems. And around 1680, his father went bankrupt. And one of his brothers, he had opened an inn, he was an innkeeper. And also with his brother, everything went wrong because his goods were confiscated. And you just have to imagine what was going on at the time that Anthony van Dyck was growing up and the time he became an artist. And this must have been frustrating and also distracting, undoubtedly. But the main point is that we have to consider in which way the career of Van Dyck was some kind of an answer to this I could say this personal tragedy. Yeah, I have the impression that he was distancing from this family drama all the time. Yeah, and this is also corroborated in a way by the fact that when Anthony van Dyck travels to Italy, Bellori, Gian Pietro Bellori, will write a kind of biography about Anthony van Dyck while he was staying in Italy. And it was published somewhere in 1672. But the interesting point is that Bellori noted that Anthony van Dyck had very rich parents and that he was grown up in wealth. And I think this is very significant because it proves that Anthony van Dyck managed to be, freed, help me, I don't know, to be, that he could leave this kind of this very complicated family background behind him. Yeah,
Right.
he could convince historiographers who were writing about him after his time in Antwerp to just to experience him as a son of a wealthy family.
Right.
And I think this was
Kathleen,
what
I
Anthony
do
van
want
Dyck really
to,
wanted to be.
Right. That's very interesting. I do want to make sure we also get a couple of questions because we're a little tight on time. So I want to
I'm
make
sorry,
sure.
I'm sorry.
But this is
I'm
fascinating
elaborating.
because it shows that the way he presents himself is not sort of in line with what you have been finding in the archive. So that casts.
That's in fact what I wanted to say. That's an ideal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that there's this disjunction. So thank you. So just to make sure that we get a couple of questions in from the audience. So Jeffrey Muller asks, thanks Katlijne for a clear and informative talk. Does Van Dyck raise in his picture his relationship with Rubens, from whom Van Dyck so much wished to escape? One thinks here of Harold Bloom's critical view in The Anxiety of Influence. So that, Katlijne, I think Jeff asked that question. Did you? So really, how is Rubens in the? Is he trying to escape Rubens?
Yeah. This is of course another question, and in my view, the way in which he wanted to, he was overacting in a way, also had to do with of course overcoming this permanent comparison with Rubens. Yeah, Rubens must have been everywhere, and we know, of course, that from 16 onwards he became a collaborator of Rubens, and we also know that Rubens appreciated what he could occasion of some official contracts. But for Anthony van Dyck, it must have been very frustrating because Rubens was his senior for about 20 years, but Rubens was also a polyglot. Rubens was someone who had a humanistic education, and Anthony van Dyck, he was a small boy who had, who had a tragic youth in a certain way, and he must have known that he had this terrific talent, this all those possibilities, but he must have been confronted every day from morning till evening with this giant Rubens. And of course, Rubens was his example, and he wanted to be as Rubens, undoubtedly, but it must also have been very, very frustrating for him. And in fact, we do not know too much about the relation between Rubens and Van Dyck. Rubens has written hundreds of letters, but there is no reference in those letters to Van Dyck.
That's a great point. And you wonder why maybe Van Dyck sort of escaped to England to be on his own for a while, right around that time. And I'm always
Rubens had just left England.
Right. So Larry, to pivot back to you, you've done, of course, a lot of work on both Bruegel and Rubens as well. And I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit. You did such a wonderful job looking at those prints by Gulcius. And of course, all of these pictures are about depicting the male human body. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, here, if PJ can put up the paired slides that we started with, go back to the two figure slides. Those are by Rubens, and they're from the they're from the Torre de la Parada cycle, the same ones. The one on the right is a sketch for the Prometheus. The one on the left is the later Rubens version of Ganymede, very close to his own hand, although we're not sure exactly in the attribution. For Rubens, even more than Van Dyck, the human body was always the center. He wrote, this is it, thank you. He wrote that treatise that is preserved fragmentarily, I think, on statues and how to copy them and how to show the body as alive. I picked these two out because they're almost opposite sides of the coin about the body. One of them is Herculean, the one on the right. It is a Titan and therefore appropriately massive and strong. Prometheus, though, is someone who was punished, as Christopher Atkins well knows, for the audacity of bringing fire to humanity. And Ganymede is rewarded solely for his beauty as Jupiter brings him up to the Olympian heights and names him as his cupbearer. That was something Rubens had painted earlier. Catalina showed the earlier version in the Liechtenstein collection. And so in both cases, we see the human body as, in some ways, the very basis of the picture, with relatively little attention to the background, which is in either case of skies. But one is downward moving and one is upward moving. And in the case of the Gulcius, many of his human bodies too, of course, are meant to be either gods or heroic figures, not necessarily tragic ones. The Four Disgracers is exceptional in tying those basically Titan figures when they weren't. The figure of Theoton or Icarus to their sinfulness. So Rubens experimented with the human body as an object of beauty and of power. In the case of Van Dyck, it's so interesting that when he puts himself into a picture, it is a vulnerable image of the human body. And in that respect, too, the questions about his relationship to Rubens and how he charted his own path are revealing. Saint Sebastian, martyred, but youthful and beautiful, had long been a subject, think of Albrecht Dürer, for example, for displaying the human body as an object of beauty, but not necessarily one of strength or heroic power. And certainly the Icarus is exactly the same. And it's fascinating to see Van Dyck seeing himself as vulnerable at this moment early in his career. And such an unusual take on this story, which is, it can be highlighted as tragedy or it can be highlighted as folly. But in all cases, Icarus is usually a model for ambition that comes aground. And what Van Dyck shows us is parental love and youthful, slender, elegant beauty, the kind that he would impose in the hands and the dress, but also often the faces of his sitters in portraits.
That is so well said, Larry. Sorry, there's a Chris, I think.
I was just going to say this question of Rubens is also fascinating in the choice of subject, that in the great iconographical tradition that you present, Larry, that Rubens is not a model for Van Dyck in this That's something we're thinking about.
He needs to distance himself. And I love about your comparison here that Rubens is also so easy in showing the old and the younger body, which is a challenge that Van Dyck also poses himself.
But interesting that the old man is based on a study, that it does not seem to be a portrait and does reappear as a type elsewhere, whereas the young Icarus is so clearly his own features.
Very true. That was fascinating to see the Tronis tradition that you showed, Katlijnen.
And those are still coming up. I mean, those pictures, Christopher was working on one at the Philadelphia Museum, Van Dyck's remarkable series. And of course, they're not as readily preserved, but I think there's more still to be found of the early Tronis of Van Dyck.
Yeah.
Indeed. Let's see, I think we are sort of at our time, and I loved how you ended the discussion, Larry, by pointing out the slender beauty of Van Dyck's portraits. So I think maybe on that note, we'll pass it on to Marije to close out this wonderful discussion. And I just want to thank all of you for your wonderful and detailed talks on these fascinating pictures.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone for this wonderful contribution today, especially our esteemed guest speakers, Katlijn van der Stiegelen and Larry Silver. And again, thank you to the delegation of Flanders and Yves Vanden for supporting the Center for Netherlandish Art in making this program possible. I also want to thank our audience for attending this event today and submitting questions during the Q&A. Due to our limited time frame, we have not been able to answer all of your questions, unfortunately. So please feel free to send us your questions on cna@mfa.org, and we will make sure to follow up. We welcome your feedback on this program, as well as your input regarding future online programming from the MFA. A pop-up will appear on your screen when leaving this virtual event to fill out an evaluation form. Your responses will help significantly in developing programs in the future. Also, in the coming days, please expect an email from us with a copy of the evaluation just introduced and resources highlighted today. We will also include more information about what is next for the Center for Netherlandish Art, and we invite you to explore more MFA Boston online events and to sign up for our CNA newsletter. For those of you interested in visiting in person, the MFA is now open to the public. Please see the MFA website for more details on obtaining advance tickets. We thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.